As the sun began to set over the city, the subway train rattled into the station. The crowd surged forward, people jostling for space in the already packed car. A young mother and her daughter stepped in, finding a small patch of standing room near the door. The mother, clutching a worn shopping bag, seemed distracted. The little girl, no older than 6, clung to her mother's arm, her wide eyes taking in the busy scene around her. A man entered the train just before the doors slid shut. He stood out. He held a faded map and a small bundle of papers. His face was lined with exhaustion, and he appeared unsure of where to stand or what to do next. His worn jacket and scuffed shoes suggested he had been traveling for quite some time. The train lurched forward, and the man stumbled, grabbing a nearby pole to steady himself. He glanced around nervously. Other passengers avoided his gaze, retreating further into their phones or books. Only a few feet away, the young girl looked up at him. She wasn't frightened, just curious. He smiled awkwardly, then quickly looked down at his map again. A few seats away, a man in a baseball cap and a plain gray sweatshirt leaned against the wall, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but his steady demeanor and the alertness in his eyes hinted at years of discipline and training. He noticed the tired man and the way the mother was preoccupied, her attention split between her daughter and something on her phone. The subway car swayed as it sped through the tunnel. The young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, but the woman barely glanced down. The man with the map hesitated, then took a step closer to the girl. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her height. His lips moved as he spoke in a soft voice. The little girl tilted her head, trying to understand. She didn't reply, but her expression remained calm. The man in the baseball cap straightened up. His eyes narrowed slightly, watching closely. Something about the situation didn't feel right, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The man's movements were hesitant but deliberate, as if he wasn't sure how to proceed. The little girl's mother finally noticed and turned her head. She froze for a moment, staring at the man near her daughter. The train screeched into the next station. A few passengers stepped off, and a new group came on board. The man with the map stepped back quickly, suddenly looking very unsure of himself. The mother reached down, pulling her daughter closer, her expression guarded. The man glanced around the car, his nervous energy growing more noticeable. The man in the baseball cap stood silently, his arms crossed, still watching. He didn't move yet, but he was ready. He had seen similar situations before, moments where something small could quickly escalate into something much more serious. The train's lights flickered briefly, and the car rocked as it entered another tunnel. The passengers settled in for the ride, but one man remained on high alert, his instincts telling him that the story unfolding before him was far from over. The train continued to sway as it barreled down the tracks. The faint hum of conversations and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails filled the air. The little girl, now clinging tightly to her mother's arm, glanced back at the man with the map. He stood a few feet away, still looking around nervously, his fingers gripping the pole so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The man's uncertain actions drew the attention of a few other passengers. One older gentleman shook his head and muttered under his breath. A young couple whispered to each other, casting quick glances toward him. It was clear that many riders had noticed him, though they avoided looking directly at him for long. They weren't sure what he wanted, but they all shared the same uneasy feeling. The off-duty Marine continued to observe quietly. His experience taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him to stay alert. The man with the map didn't seem dangerous, at least not in a typical sense. He looked more lost than threatening, but something about his actions, the way he lingered too long near the child, the way he hesitated, made the Marine's protective instincts kick in. The train jolted as it rounded a sharp turn, causing passengers to sway and grip the overhead handles. The man stumbled again, this time bumping into a young man in a suit. "Sorry," the man said quickly, his accent thick, and his words hurried. The suited man barely acknowledged him, brushing off his sleeve as if the man's touch had left a stain. The little girl turned her gaze back to the man with the map. She seemed curious rather than scared. Perhaps she didn't sense the tension in the air like the adults did. She looked up at her mother, tugging her sleeve, but the mother's focus was now squarely on the man. Her body had shifted subtly, placing herself slightly between her daughter and the stranger. The Marine shifted his stance, inching closer. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he needed a better position if something went wrong. His eyes never left the man's hands, watching for any sudden movements. He'd been in enough situations to know that staying calm and prepared was the best approach. As the train slowed into the next station, the man seemed to notice the growing attention on him. He glanced around, catching a few stares before quickly looking down at his map again. His shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. The mother reached out, gently pulling her daughter into her lap, her movements protective but calm. The little girl frowned, clearly not understanding what was happening, but she didn't resist. The Marine took a deep breath. Nothing had happened yet. Just a series of small actions that put everyone on edge. But in his experience, it was often these quiet, seemingly minor moments that determined how events would unfold. He decided to stay vigilant, ready to act if the man did anything more than stand awkwardly with his crumpled papers. For now, the train moved on, carrying its uneasy passengers further into the city. The subway car rumbled onward, the tunnel lights flickering through the windows. Passengers continued to shift uneasily, sneaking glances at the man with the map. His nervous movements stood out in the packed car. He kept checking the paper in his hands, as if searching for a clue that wasn't there. Every few seconds, he would glance up, his gaze darting between the little girl and the mother holding her. The girl, now seated on her mother's lap, fidgeted. Her curious eyes studied the man, who didn't seem to notice her attention. The mother, however, was fully aware. Her body remained tense, her arms securely around her daughter. She didn't speak, but her face showed that she was ready to act if needed. The air around her was sharp with silent worry. Nearby, the Marine adjusted his footing, leaning casually against the wall. He stayed quiet, his face calm, but his mind was racing. His instincts kept telling him something wasn't right. Although the man hadn't done anything openly threatening, his behavior set off alarms. He seemed out of place, confused, unsure, and most of all, anxious. The Marine knew these kinds of signals were easy to miss, but he had learned to trust his gut. As the train hit another bump, the man with the map stumbled forward again. This time, he grabbed the pole near the mother and child. The sudden motion drew sharp breaths from a few passengers. The mother's eyes locked on the man's hand, which was uncomfortably close to her daughter's shoulder. She shifted slightly, pulling the child even closer. The Marine didn't move right away. He knew the importance of staying calm. Rushing in too quickly could escalate the situation. Instead, he waited, his gaze fixed on the man's hands, watching for any sign of danger. A subtle glance around the car confirmed what he suspected. Other passengers were equally on edge. Their wide eyes and stiff postures spoke volumes. No one knew exactly what was going on, but everyone could sense the tension building. The man with the map opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again. His lips pressed into a thin line. It was as if he wanted to explain himself but couldn't find the words. Instead, he held onto the pole tightly and lowered his gaze. The Marine noticed his breathing was uneven, shallow and quick. The man looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else. The mother, holding her daughter, never stopped watching the man. Her protective instincts were fully awakened now. She didn't say anything, but her body language was clear. She was ready to protect her child if it came to that. The little girl, still young enough to be unaware of the deeper tensions, seemed puzzled. Her head turned slightly, trying to get a better look at the man, but her mother gently pressed her head down, whispering for her to stay still. The train slowed again, screeching as it approached the next station. The man glanced up, then back down at his map. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking more out of place than ever. The Marine took a slow, steady breath. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready. As the train rolled into the next station, the man with the map looked toward the doors, hesitating. He didn't move to exit, just fidgeted where he stood. His fingers smoothed the wrinkled map repeatedly, a nervous habit that only drew more attention. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between the man, the young mother, and the little girl. The mother had grown more protective. She pulled her daughter even closer, wrapping both arms around her. The child, still curious but sensing the tension, remained quiet. Her wide eyes peeked over her mother's arm, fixed on the man nearby. The other passengers whispered among themselves, but no one took action. They were all waiting, unsure of what might happen next. The off-duty Marine leaned casually against the wall, though his mind was anything but relaxed. He had seen situations like this before, ordinary moments that could shift suddenly. His training taught him to stay calm, observe, and only step in when necessary. For now, he stayed alert, his sharp eyes tracking every move the man made. The man with the map finally glanced up. His eyes met the mother's, and he opened his mouth as if to say something. The mother tensed, her grip on her daughter tightening. But no words came out. Instead, the man shook his head slightly and looked away. His actions weren't threatening, but they were unsettling. He seemed to be battling with himself, unsure of what to do or how to explain himself. As the train began moving again, the man shifted his position. He still held onto the pole near the mother and child, though he kept his gaze down. The Marine's posture changed slightly, ever so subtle, but enough to signal he was ready to act. He didn't need to speak. His steady presence alone was a warning that he was watching. The tension in the car grew thicker with every passing moment. A few passengers coughed nervously. Others tried to focus on their phones, pretending not to notice what was happening. But it was impossible to ignore. The atmosphere had changed, and everyone felt it. Then, as the train approached another curve, the man stumbled again. This time, his hand brushed the mother's arm. She flinched, pulling her daughter back quickly. Her sharp movement caught everyone's attention. The Marine's eyes narrowed, his body shifting forward ever so slightly. But the man quickly raised his hands, palm out, as if to say, "I'm sorry." He didn't try to touch them again. He stepped back, still holding the pole, his head lowered. The mother glared at him, her protective instincts fully triggered. The Marine relaxed just a little, but his focus never wavered. Whatever had almost happened, he was ready to stop it. The rest of the train ride passed in uneasy silence, everyone waiting to see what the man would do next. The subway train clattered through another dark tunnel, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering slightly. The air in the car felt heavy, as if every passenger was holding their breath. The man with the map stood motionless now, gripping the pole so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. He kept his head down, glancing at his papers but never speaking a word. The mother held her daughter close, her jaw tight, her body still like a coiled spring. The little girl shifted in her mother's lap, glancing back at the man who had caused such quiet tension. To her, he didn't seem scary. He looked tired and sad. She didn't understand why her mother was so tense or why the other passengers kept staring. To her, he was just another person on the train. But the rest of the car knew better. Something felt off. The off-duty Marine stood nearby, blending into the background. His calm, watchful eyes missed nothing. Though his face remained neutral, his mind was ready for anything. He'd spent years training for moments like this, moments where something small might lead to something dangerous. He wasn't going to let that happen. The train hit a slight bump, causing the man with the map to stumble. He caught himself quickly, but the sudden motion made the mother flinch. Her arms tightened protectively around her daughter, who wriggled uncomfortably. "Mommy," the girl whispered, "why are you squeezing me?" "Shay," the mother murmured, her eyes never leaving the man. She didn't mean to sound harsh, but the stress in her voice was clear. The little girl frowned and stopped moving, though she still looked curiously at the man nearby. As the train rolled into the next station, a few passengers got off. The man didn't move. He stayed by the pole, still clutching his papers. He looked as though he wanted to say something, to explain himself or to apologize, but no words came out. His lips pressed together, and he simply shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Another passenger, an older woman sitting across from him, shook her head and muttered something under her breath. She had been watching him for several stops now, and it was clear she didn't trust him. Her muttering caught the attention of others, and soon a few quiet whispers spread through the car. The man seemed to hear them. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he looked down again, almost as if he wanted to disappear. The Marine took a slow breath, his body relaxed but ready. He noticed every detail: the man's trembling hands, the mother's protective grip, the little girl's innocent curiosity. He also noticed how the tension in the car had spread. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The man didn't have to do anything for people to suspect him. His awkward presence, his hesitant movements, they were enough to make everyone uneasy. The train picked up speed again, leaving the station behind. The Marine kept his eyes on the man, waiting. For now, nothing had happened, but he was prepared for whatever might come next. "You said." The subway sped into another tunnel, the rhythmic click-clack of the tracks filling the silence. Passengers huddled in their seats or clung to poles, stealing wary glances at the man with the map. He hadn't made any sudden moves, but his presence alone seemed to keep the entire car on edge. His hands trembled as they gripped the pole, and his eyes darted nervously toward the young mother and her daughter. The little girl shifted in her mother's lap, her head tilted slightly as she studied the man. She didn't understand why everyone seemed so tense. To her, he didn't look mean or dangerous. He just looked tired. She whispered, "Mommy, is that man okay?" "Just stay quiet, honey," the mother replied softly, keeping her voice calm but firm. Her arms were wrapped protectively around her daughter. Her sharp eyes never left the man, and her body was ready to move if needed. In the corner of the car, the off-duty Marine remained still, observing everything. He noticed the little girl's innocent curiosity and the mother's tightened grip. His years of training had taught him that body language often spoke louder than words. Right now, the mother's posture screamed one thing: protectiveness. But what stood out even more was the man's behavior. He hadn't said anything threatening. He hadn't made any aggressive moves. Yet his anxious glances and unsteady hands raised everyone's suspicion. The Marine knew that sometimes fear alone could make a situation spiral out of control. He wasn't about to let that happen. The train hit a rough patch, causing a few passengers to lose their balance. The man stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady himself. His hand brushed against the pole next to the mother's seat, and she flinched. Her reaction was small, but it was enough to make the little girl notice. The girl looked up at her mother, confused, and then back at the man. "I think he's just lost," the girl whispered. Her voice was light and innocent, cutting through the heavy atmosphere of the car. The man's head turned toward the sound. For a moment, his tired eyes met the girl's. His face softened, and he opened his mouth as if to speak. But no words came out. He quickly looked away, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. The mother pulled her daughter closer. "Shay," she whispered, trying to maintain control. But the little girl's words had caught the attention of others. A few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions unsure. The Marine noticed it too, how a single innocent observation from a child had changed the mood slightly. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it felt different now, less sharp, more uncertain. The train began to slow down again, approaching another station. The man with the map shifted nervously, as if he might get off. The Marine's gaze followed his every move, ready for anything. The mother held her daughter close, the passengers stayed quiet, and the train eased into the next stop. The moment passed without incident, But the question lingered. What would happen next? As the train came to a stop, the subway car doors slid open, letting a rush of cool air into the car. A few passengers stepped off, but the man with the map remained in place, holding tightly to the pole. He glanced around nervously, his eyes flicking toward the young mother and her child, then toward the off-duty Marine, who stood quietly but alert. The tension that had built up in the car seemed to follow the train as it pulled away from the platform. The mother adjusted her grip on her daughter, her protective instincts still heightened. The little girl, now resting her head on her mother's chest, seemed to sense the unease around her but stayed silent. The other passengers sat stiffly, their eyes darting between the man, the Marine, and the mother with her child. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He held his map in one hand, the other hand gripping the pole as though it was the only thing keeping him steady. His face was pale and lined with exhaustion. He seemed to want to say something, but no words came. He looked at the Marine once, quickly, then lowered his gaze again. The Marine didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched, his calm presence both reassuring and commanding. Another passenger coughed, breaking the heavy silence. The sound startled the man with the map. His head snapped up, and for a brief moment, he looked around at the people staring at him. The older woman sitting across from him gave him a hard look, her lips pressed tightly together. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, and returned to staring out the window. The train picked up speed, its wheels clattering loudly against the rails. The man leaned into the pole as though it was the only stable thing in his world. His fingers twitched, and his map fell to the floor. He bent down quickly to pick it up, his movements awkward and jerky. The mother flinched at the sudden motion, pulling her daughter even closer. The little girl frowned but said nothing, her small hands gripping her mother's arms for comfort. The Marine took a small step forward. It wasn't much, just enough to let the man know he was there, watching. He didn't speak, but his presence alone seemed to have an effect. The man froze for a moment, clutching his map tightly. Then he straightened up slowly, his shoulders slumping. He didn't make eye contact with anyone again, instead staring at the floor. The train entered another tunnel, the lights flickering briefly. The passengers settled back into their uneasy silence, each one waiting for the next stop, the next moment, the next shift in the tension. The Marine stayed alert, the mother stayed guarded, and the man stayed silent. No one knew how the ride would end, but everyone felt the weight of the moment hanging heavily over them. The subway car rattled on, carrying its passengers deeper into the city. The air remained thick with tension, even as no words were spoken. The man with the map clung tightly to his pole, his knuckles white. He barely moved now, standing stiffly, as if afraid to do anything else. The mother adjusted her position on the seat, keeping her daughter close. She whispered softly into her child's ear, her voice calm but firm. "Stay still, honey. We're almost there." The little girl nodded, her gaze flitting back toward the man. Even though her mother was clearly uneasy, the girl couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He looked so tired, so lost. She didn't understand why he made everyone nervous, but she trusted her mother's judgment. The off-duty Marine remained standing, leaning lightly against the wall. His arms crossed over his chest, he watched without staring. His quiet, steady presence acted as an anchor in the room. He noticed every detail. The man's twitching fingers, the mother's protective grip, the way other passengers avoided looking directly at the man but couldn't help sneaking quick glances. As the train slowed for another stop, the man with the map glanced at the doors. He seemed unsure, hesitating as if he might leave. But when the doors opened, he stayed put. Several passengers got off, and new ones boarded. The car shifted as people moved, filling the space once more. The man's nervous energy seemed to transfer to those around him. The whispers started again, just soft enough not to be heard clearly, but loud enough to add to the unease. The Marine stayed where he was, his face calm, his body relaxed but ready. He'd learned long ago how to project confidence without appearing threatening. Just standing there, with his quiet confidence, he sent a message: "I'm watching, and I'm prepared." The other passengers didn't seem to notice him directly, but they felt the change. Even the mother glanced at him once, a hint of relief flickering in her eyes before she turned back to her child. The train picked up speed again, the car rocking gently as it re-entered the dark tunnels. The man with the map looked down at his hands, then at the map, then at his hands again. He shifted his weight, his movements small but still noticeable. The older woman sitting nearby shook her head, muttering to herself once more. Her disapproving look was sharp, but she said nothing loud enough for anyone to respond. The little girl yawned, her head resting against her mother's shoulder. She whispered again, "Mommy, is he okay?" Her mother stroked her hair and murmured, "I don't know, sweetie. Let's just stay close, okay?" The Marine caught that brief exchange. He admired the mother's calm strength, even as her concern was clear. He kept his focus on the man, ready for anything, but hoping nothing more would happen. As the train sped on, everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the ride to come to an end. As the train approached its final stops, the atmosphere in the subway car remained tense. The man with the map hadn't moved much, still clutching the pole as if it were the only solid thing he could trust. His eyes darted around occasionally, but mostly he kept his gaze on the floor. The mother held her daughter tightly, whispering soft reassurances to the child who now seemed more confused than curious. The passengers avoided eye contact, pretending to focus on their phones or staring out the window at the dark tunnel walls. The off-duty Marine stayed standing near the back of the car. He hadn't said a word all this time, but his steady, watchful presence was impossible to ignore. He remained calm, his arms loosely crossed as he kept an eye on the man's every movement. While he didn't sense immediate danger, his instincts told him it wasn't time to relax yet. He had seen enough tense situations before to know that the moment you let your guard down was often when trouble started. As the train slowed for another stop, the man with the map glanced up. For the first time, he seemed to notice how many people were watching him. He shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping further under the invisible weight of their stares. The Marine noted this shift, mentally filing it away. It wasn't the movement of someone preparing to lash out, but rather the behavior of someone unsure of themselves. Nervous, awkward, perhaps overwhelmed. When the doors opened, a few more passengers left the car. The older woman who had been muttering earlier shot the man one last disapproving glance before stepping off. She had been one of the most openly suspicious riders, and her departure left a little more breathing room, though the tension still hung in the air. The train started moving again, and the little girl stirred in her mother's arms. "Mommy," she whispered, "are we getting off soon?" "Yes, honey," her mother replied, stroking her hair. Her voice was calm, but her body was still on edge. She kept her daughter close, never taking her eyes off the man nearby. The Marine watched as the man fidgeted with his map, folding it and unfolding it over and over. It was a nervous habit, not the actions of someone planning harm. Still, the Marine didn't relax. He remained vigilant, ready to step in if something unexpected happened. But part of him also wondered if the man was simply lost, frightened, unsure, out of place. The train began to slow again, this time for the mother and daughter's stop. As they stood up, the mother kept a firm hold on her child, her movements deliberate. She guided the little girl toward the door without looking back. The man with the map didn't follow them, didn't say a word. He simply watched them leave, his hands still clutching the pole. The Marine shifted his weight but didn't move. He waited, ensuring that nothing would follow the mother and her child. As the train pulled away, he glanced at the man again. The tension in the car was easing now. The mother and daughter were gone, and the passengers began to settle. The Marine relaxed slightly but stayed alert, ready to act if needed. For now, the situation had ended without incident. He silently hoped the man would find his way, whatever it was he was looking for, and that no harm would come to anyone. As the train carried on into the city, the air felt lighter, the unease fading into the distance.